In Chapter 10, we move on to the topic of evolution by means of natural selection. Chapter 10 and 12 constitute our Unit 3. So both of these chapters are on how populations change over time. We'll see the mechanism and a way to quantify that evolution in Chapter 10, and then in Chapter 12, we'll move into what we call macroevolution, which is the origin of new species rather than just changing of a population. So let's start by defining evolution. So evolution can be defined in two different ways, sort of depending on your goal, and if you're talking about a general mechanism or a very specific mechanism. So first of all, evolution can be defined as a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So this means that in a particular population, some traits over time are going to increase in frequency and others are going to decrease. And so as those changes take place within a population through a variety of mechanisms, evolution is occurring. Basically, the population is changing. The other way you can define evolution is by descent with modification. So this means that organisms are similar to one another because they are related by a common ancestor, but they are different because over time their populations have been modified so that those groups of organisms better fit their environment. Now, both of these definitions encompass the idea of natural selection, that certain traits enhance the survival of an organism and therefore will increase in the population. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the ways that evolution and natural selection can occur. So let's start by looking at an example of what we mean by a population changing over time. So very often we can actually demonstrate the process of evolution in a laboratory, in a controlled experiment. So this experiment looked at and attempted to answer the question, could you breed fruit flies to withstand going without food? So the average fruit fly can live for about 20 hours without eating anything. Now, at about 20 hours, you are probably getting hangry. I know I'm getting hangry, but flies are going to start to die. They're very small. They don't have a large reservoir to store fat and other nutrients within their body, so they have to eat quite frequently. So researchers wanted to answer this question. Can you increase the time that a fly can go without food? So down here we have a graph that shows the average. So of course an average means that there are extremes on both ends. So the average fly lives about 20 hours without food. Some appear to start dying off more rapidly, 10, 15 hours. And then some can live a bit longer. So in order to conduct this experiment, individuals started with a population of flies, about 5,000 flies, and they put them in a cage and removed their food. So after about 80% of the fruit flies had died, they took those remaining flies and they fed them because after 20, 30 hours or so, you want to be fed anyway. So they did this to the flies. They found that they had about 500 flies at that point. So now the thought here is that there is some sort of genetic component in those flies, a variation in one of their or multiple of their genes that allows them to survive. So they fed these flies that had survived and they let them breed. Now, the next generation of flies, they did the same thing. They let them grow to maturity and then they took their food away. And they waited until about 80% of the flies had died, took them out, bred them, repeated this process 5 times. So what they saw was that the original population averaged about 20 hours. So they could live about 20 hours without food. After one round of selection, they found that this increased just a little bit. They found that those flies could survive for about 23 hours. So those flies that could survive for 23 hours were the ones that were bred for the next generation. So they found through 60 generations, which is actually not very long for fruit flies, that they could have a population of fruit flies that could live for 160 hours before dying of starvation. So this would suggest that there was some sort of genetic component that those flies that were surviving, that 20% that were surviving, were actually passing on something to their offspring that allowed them to survive without food. And the researchers were able to select for that trait by only choosing the individuals that had the trait that they wanted. So over many, many generations now, we have an increase in the amount of time that this population of flies can survive without food. So here we see evolution in a laboratory setting. We see a change in a population over time. So we are going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about how evolution actually occurs. What is the process that is occurring in that population of fruit flies that is allowing them to survive, and how are other environmental factors and other impacts on the population going to affect how that population changes. So we're going to talk about the mechanism of evolution. So evolution occurs because some individuals are born with characteristics that make them more likely to survive compared to other individuals. So we're going to talk about the mechanisms of evolution, the sort of processes that affect a population and cause them to change over time. And then we're going to talk about 5 lines of evidence for evolution and the process of natural selection. So before we talk about the actual process of evolution and talk about Charles Darwin, let's talk about the general idea before Darwin. So before Darwin, the general feeling or sentiment was that the earth had been created by God and it was unchanged since the beginning of time. So many beliefs about humans and their place in the world really had not changed for about the previous 2 centuries before Charles Darwin. And that was because for most of them, the Bible sufficiently explained natural phenomenon. Most people thought that the earth was about 6,000 years old and was largely unchanging. And this was based on, that number is based on doing calculations on generations in the Bible and looking at the idea of creationism and sort of reading the Bible to interpret the beginnings of Earth and that time period of creation and how things came about. So people recognized that organisms existed in groups, that there was variation, but most people thought that all species, including humans, had been created simultaneously, and then they never changed and they never died out. But Charles Darwin was influenced by many people. Charles Darwin was not working in a bubble. And prior to him, people began thinking about creation and all of the geology on Earth and all of the variety on Earth. And so in the 1700s and 1800s, science was sort of advancing rapidly in this area of trying to explain some of the processes that were occurring on Earth. So for example, in 1778, French naturalist, I'm going to mess up his name because I don't speak French, Georges Louis Leclerc calculated that the Earth was about 75,000 years old. So a bit older than the biblical date of the Earth. And he based his timing on the minimum time required for the planet to cool. So in order for basically the minimum amount of time required for the Earth to be habitable. And then there were a few others we're going to talk about a little bit more specifically here. So George Cuvier was another man who strongly influenced Charles Darwin, and Cuvier was basically a paleontologist. He discovered fossil remains at the bottoms of coal and slate mines, and he noticed that they were unlike any living species that were currently on Earth. So many people many people challenged this because they felt that biblical stories didn't allow for species to be wiped out. And so he sort of caused a little rift. His books and publications documented things like Irish elk, mastodons, giant ground sloth, those animals that are pictured there. And they had no resemblance to current living animals. Cuvier was not really a proponent of the idea of evolution. He was simply observing what was going on. But the fact that fossils were found that shows organisms that no longer were living on Earth supports the idea that the process of extinction is occurring. And so this sort of contradicts the idea that there is that populations are unchanging, that the Earth is unchanging since the beginning of time. Now we'll talk about fossils a little bit later, but fossils are generally used as one of the supporting lines of evidence for the process of evolution. And that's because living organisms tend to be similar to fossils that are younger. And those fossils that are older tend to be more different from younger fossils or organisms that are currently alive. So another man that strongly influenced Charles Darwin was JeanBaptiste Lamarck. So if you've had a science class before, you're probably familiar with this guy. He's generally credited for being wrong about his ideas of why organisms change over time, but he was actually quite important in Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, JeanBaptiste Lamarck put forth the idea of acquired characteristics and the idea of use and disuse. So Lamarck felt that if a feature was used more often, it would become more prominent in that organism. So basically, if a trait was beneficial or useful, it would increase over the lifetime of the organism. And then that trait would be passed on to the next generation, and the process would continue. If that trait was beneficial for the next generation, it would increase or become more prominent over that individual's lifetime. Now, the example that's always used is the example of the long necks on a giraffe. I happen to like giraffes, so I put a lot of pictures here. But basically, the idea would be that at some point a giraffe had a slightly longer neck, and he was able to reach higher branches. So over his lifetime, that neck grew. And then at some point, that individual had a baby who had a longer neck. And as that individual grew throughout his lifetime, his neck would grow longer. Now, this directly contradicts the current idea of evolution, because in the current idea of evolution, individuals do not change. They're basically genetically static. They have the trait that they're born with, and that's it. Those traits don't change over time. The traits in a population can change over time. But Lamarck was not, he was still important because he recognized that organisms can change over time, that organisms are, and when I say organisms, I mean groups of organisms. Groups of organisms are not static. They can actually change. So he recognized that if something was useful, it could be passed on to the next generation. He just didn't quite have the process figured out yet. Lamarck is also important because he categorized organisms based on similarities. And he actually gives us our biological hierarchy, the way that we organize living species. And he also gave us the two-part naming system of living organisms. So organisms are named based on the Latin names for their genus and species, which are just hierarchical groupings. So for example, a wolf is, a domesticated dog, there we go, is Canis lupus. The Canis is the larger group, the genus, and that is the canine type animals, and then lupus is the actual species. Homo sapiens, the scientific name for humans. Homo meaning, or Homo is the larger group. Sapiens is our specific group. So Lamarck was not unimportant in history. He was actually quite important and influential for Charles Darwin. So then we have a man named Charles Lyell, and Charles Lyell was a geologist, and he wrote a book in the mid-1800s that very strongly influenced Charles Darwin. So Lyell argued that the geological features on Earth were made over a long period of time. So they were formed gradually, and they were continuing to form. And this was important for Darwin for a couple of reasons. Because one, this idea that there was a gradual formation of these massive geological formations and geological shapes meant that the Earth had to be older than they previously thought. But this also helped Charles Darwin with his theory, because Darwin thought, hey, if these geological forces can shape the Earth slowly over time, why can't living organisms change as well? And then this also gave Charles Darwin a longer time frame for all of this diversity in living organisms to happen. So not only did it give him the idea of a slow gradual change over time, but it also gave him the time for that biological change to occur. So Charles Darwin was a Englishman. He was a naturalist, and he didn't start out studying nature. He actually first went to school to be a doctor, didn't like that, so his dad sent him to be to school to be a parish minister. He didn't like theology either, and eventually he took a job on a ship called the HMS Beagle. Now, this was a British ship that was commissioned to basically do mapping. So they were going to leave England, sail around the world, and map coastlines of South America and some other regions that they encountered along the way. Now, this was really important because it allowed Darwin to do what he actually did love, which was to study nature. And so Darwin was employed on this ship to basically be the captain's buddy on on this trip. So while the ship was mapping the coastline of South America, Darwin went along and walked along the shore and explored some of the areas in South America and collected specimens from all over. Plant specimens, animal specimens, fossils. He collected a whole bunch of birds. He collected leaves and things like that. He collected them and then sent them back to England to be cataloged and sorted by experts in the various fields. Now, Darwin's most famous observations probably come out of the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are a chain of islands off of the coast of South America. And the Galapagos Islands were really important because islands are actually a very unique location because they are isolated from some of the other places or some of, I'm sorry, some of the other environments that are found on the mainland. So basically, if you have a specific environment on an island, the organisms there are going to be very specifically adapted for that island. So the Galapagos Islands was a chain of volcanic islands. It had a lot of unusual species and a lot of species diversity. And so Charles Darwin did a lot of his work there, observing the different organisms and features in those places. So Darwin observed a few things while he was on the HMS Beagle. So Darwin was looking at the traits or the physical characteristics of living organisms, and he cataloged things. He took a lot of detailed notes, and so this was very helpful so that when he got back to England, when he was finished with his voyage on the Beagle, he was able to go back and sort of piece together all of this evidence that he had acquired throughout his travels. So Darwin made a couple of really important observations. The first is that different island finches or different island organisms resembled the mainland species. So he noted that individuals who were more closely related shared similar but slightly different physical characteristics. And so he could trace sort of this lineage from the different islands to a related species on the mainland. Now I know it's kind of small. If you look here, we've got the coast, the western coast of South America, that's Ecuador there. The mainland, and then we've got the Galapagos Islands off the western coast of South America. And so he noted that all of the finches on the Galapagos Islands were very similar to one of the finches on the mainland. But he noticed that each one also had very specific characteristics for the unique environments found on each of the islands. So one of the notable things that he noticed was different types of beaks. So you'll see some of these guys have larger beaks, medium-sized beaks, and small beaks, and those are related to the types of food that they eat. So Darwin collected all of these creatures. He collected a whole bunch of finches that he actually thought were all, some of them even different birds. He thought they were all different types of birds, but he found out that they were actually 14 different species. So the 14 different species of finches actually resembled each other and also resembled the mainland. So this was sort of a key observation in observing that organisms are uniquely adapted to their environment, and they have traits that make them adapted to their environment. So the other thing that Charles Darwin noted was that there was a similarity between the fossils of extinct species in a particular area and the living species in that same area. So for instance, he found giant fossils from a group called Glyptodonts. That's this guy over here. And he thought this guy looked very similar to armadillos. So they were much bigger, but they had very similar characteristics to armadillos that actually lived in the same area. So he reasoned that if these glyptodonts lived in South America in the past and armadillos were currently living there, why was there only one species? So he proposed that the glyptodonts were actually ancient relatives of the armadillos, but that the glyptodonts had become extinct because they had characteristics that were not favorable in a changing environment, and that the armadillo was sort of the current best suited species in the area. So the sort of overall kind of summary that we can get from these two important observations is a really common theme in biology, and this is something called unity and diversity. So evolution helps to explain the diversity of living creatures that we have on Earth. So think about those finches. Not all finches are the same. There's a wide variety of different types of finches, but the process of evolution also explains the relatedness of organisms, or the unity of organisms. They appear similar because they have a common ancestor. So this idea of descent with modification that we're going to talk about in just a minute is this idea that the process of evolution both unites similarly appearing species and explains why there are a variety of different organisms found on Earth. So one more individual that influenced Charles Darwin and really sort of got his wheels turning on this process of evolution was a man named Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus was not a biologist. He was actually an economist, and he wrote several papers and books on population economics and how human populations change over time. So Thomas Malthus basically said that the Earth's human population is suffering because of a competition for resources. Now, he also said that when things are good, when people have enough food, their population is going to grow exponentially. But at some point, the population is going to grow faster than food supplies, and that this is going to cause problems and strife, and not everyone's going to be able to survive. So Charles Darwin took Charles Lyell's ideas on geology and gradual change, and then he also took Thomas Malthus's idea that there's competition, that organisms produce too many offspring, and he suggested that organisms who are individuals who are better suited to their environment are basically going to win, and those who don't have favorable characteristics are going to lose. So on the bottom here we have a quote from one of Charles Darwin's drafts of his ideas, that favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. So basically what he's saying here is that organisms are going to have to compete for survival, and those that have particular variations that make them more competitive are going to be able to survive and pass on their genes. Those that don't have those favorable variations are not going to survive, and those traits are basically going to die out. So Charles Darwin wasn't the only one who came up with this idea of evolution by natural selection. There was another man working at the same time named Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, Wallace was actually working in Malaysia. He was working in the Malay archipelago over sort of between Asia and Australia, all those islands there. And he wrote to Charles Darwin asking him to read his ideas on evolution by natural selection. Basically, Alfred Russel Wallace had done the same thing that Charles Darwin had done. He was just doing it in a different location. And so he came up with this same theory of descent with modification by means of natural selection about the same time that Charles Darwin did. Now, up to this point, Charles Darwin had not actually published anything. He boarded the Beagle quite some time before he actually published anything. 1831. He finally published his ideas in 1859 because he was afraid that basically Alfred Russel Wallace was going to trump him. And so he finally published his work. Now, he hadn't published it previously because he knew it was going to cause a big to-do in the world, in the scientific community and in the religious community, and he didn't want to publish until he, quote unquote, knew that he had it right. He didn't want to propose this basically earth-shattering idea without having ample evidence to support it. And that's why it took him almost 30 years to actually publish his first book, The Origin of Species. So on the bottom here, we have sort of a summary of before Darwin and after Darwin. So after Darwin, the ideas related to evolution were that organisms do change over time. Some of them have gone extinct. The earth has to be older than the Bible suggests, and that geology of the earth is always changing. Now, this led him to his mechanism for the process of evolution, which is natural selection. So this idea of descent with modification, I sort of have a summary here, is that organisms are descended from, that's your descent part, a common ancestor or a similar ancestral species, but that they are different, there's the modification part, because they face unique environmental pressures that cause the population to change over time. And so he proposed that this evolution and descent with modification occurred by means of a process called natural selection.